Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. Your job is simple. Listen. Let the language wash over you. You don't need to understand every word. Just stay with the conversation, follow the ideas, and let your English do what it's designed to do: absorb. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Imagine living in a world where the global economy is just so deeply intertwined that a sudden financial shock on one side of the planet practically instantly crashes commodity prices on the other.
Yeah, complete ripple effect.
Right. A world where capital just flows seamlessly across international borders and, labor mobility is at this absolute all-time high. Like literally millions of people crossing oceans every single year in search of better wages.
You're probably picturing what, the height of the 1990s dot-com boom.
Exactly. Or maybe, I don't know, the world right before the 2008 financial crisis. But that description actually applies perfectly to the year 1914.
Which is pretty wild to think about.
It is. And shortly after reaching that incredible peak of global integration, that entire system violently tore itself apart.
It's one of the most sobering historical realities we actually face when looking at the sources.
Yeah.
We have this pervasive modern bias where we just assume that global integration is this one-way street.
Right, like a continuous march of progress.
Exactly. Yeah, like it started with the internet and it inevitably ends with a perfectly borderless world. But the reality is far more volatile.
Which is why we really need to ground this conversation in something tangible before we get too academic. So look down for a second at the shirt you are wearing right now. Just really look at the fabric.
It's a great example.
Because that single everyday piece of clothing is a physical map of a staggering invisible web, and you're sitting right at the center of it. Chances are that shirt was conceptualized and designed by someone sitting in an office in one country.
Mm-hmm.
The raw cotton or the synthetic fibers, probably produced in a completely different second country, subsidized by their specific agricultural policies.
Yeah, and shipped somewhere else entirely.
Right. Those materials were shipped off to be cut and sewn in a third country, which is heavily reliant on a specific local labor market. And then it's handed over to this massive distribution network run by a logistics conglomerate headquartered in a fourth country.
Before you finally walk into a store or click a button and buy it in a fifth country. The sheer level of coordination required to make that happen is, it's profound. We totally take it for granted every single morning when we get dressed.
Yeah, we just put it on and don't think about it.
But the mechanisms required to move that shirt from a concept to a physical object in your closet, they involve, international trade law, currency exchange markets, global shipping infrastructure.
Labor arbitrage.
Exactly. All working in tandem.
And it doesn't stop at your closet either. Think about the smartphone sitting right there in your pocket, or maybe you're holding it right now. That little glass and metal rectangle is practically a miracle of global supply chains.
Oh, absolutely.
It contains microscopic components manufactured across a dozen different countries. The raw materials inside it, like the cobalt, the lithium, the rare earth metals, those were extracted from several different continents under completely different regulatory environments.
Not to mention the intellectual property.
Right. The actual engineering brilliance that makes the touchscreen responsive and the processor fast, that was developed by teams of engineers scattered across multiple nations, and the software it runs on is constantly being updated by developers distributed all over the globe.
It basically operates as a physical manifestation of modern integration. You are holding the output of millions of disparate human actions, coordinated across languages and borders, right there in the palm of your hand.
Even your morning routine is tied to this web. The coffee beans in your cup were likely grown in a country you might never actually visit in your lifetime.
Harvested by agricultural workers whose daily wages aren't determined by their local cost of living.
Yeah, exactly. They're tied directly to the minute-by-minute fluctuations of a global commodity market trading thousands of miles away. Those beans are roasted by a massive multinational corporation and finally served to you by a local business whose own supply chain for, paper cups and espresso machines extends all the way around the planet.
When we lay out the everyday environment like that, The sheer scale of the phenomenon just becomes impossible to ignore. We are living inside an economic architecture that touches every single aspect of human life.
And that really sets the mission for today's deep dive. We are going to unpack this massive, complex, and honestly, frequently misunderstood force that we generally call globalization.
Right.
Looking through the extensive source material we've gathered, the goal here is to move far beyond the slick corporate buzzwords and the really simplistic political talking points.
Because there's a lot of noise out there.
So much noise. We want to examine what this unprecedented global integration actually is, how it was meticulously and sometimes brutally built over centuries, what it has achieved, and what it continues to cost us.
Because the ledger is incredibly complicated.
It really is. I mean, on one hand, this system has produced the most sustained reduction in extreme poverty in the history of our species.
It has generated material wealth and technological transfer at a pace that is genuinely hard to comprehend.
But on the other hand, it has brought severe localized devastation. We're talking about massive regional deindustrialization, brutal labor market disruptions, environmental damage that just totally ignores national borders.
And a fierce political backlash that the original advocates of this system completely failed to predict.
Completely blind to it. So to even begin analyzing a ledger that complex, we really have to establish a rigorous analytical framework.
Definitely. The single biggest mistake commentators make is treating globalization as if it's a monolith.
Like it's just one giant switch that's either flipped on or off.
Exactly. To understand the nuances, particularly the modern political turbulence we see in the sources, we have to separate globalization into 4 distinct intersecting dimensions.
I want to make sure we define those clearly before we go any further. So what are the 4 dimensions we're looking at?
So the first dimension is economic integration. This is the one we hear about most often, right? The flow of trade, capital, and investment across international borders. It's the supply chain of your smartphone.
Okay, that's number 1.
And the second dimension is cultural flows. This involves the movement of ideas, media, symbolic resources, and even linguistic trends. It's how a teenager in Seoul and a teenager in São Paulo can bond over the exact same streaming series or musical genre.
So economics and culture, what are the other 2?
The third is the political dimension. This is the architecture of international governance, the institutions, treaties, non-governmental organizations, and the shifting concepts of national sovereignty itself.
And the 4th?
The fourth dimension is migration, the actual physical movement of human beings across borders, whether driven by economic opportunity, conflict, or climate change.
Having those 4 buckets is just incredibly helpful because if you try to analyze the political backlash of today, the rise of economic nationalism, without understanding that these 4 dimensions operate on completely different tracks and at different speeds, the world just looks like absolute chaos.
You'd completely miss the underlying mechanics. I mean, you might have a period where economic integration is accelerating wildly, but political integration is totally stalled.
Or cultural flows are moving at the speed of the internet, but physical migration is being heavily restricted by new border walls.
Exactly. The friction between these dimensions is where the conflict actually happens.
Right. And to understand that conflict and to really grasp how that incredibly complex supply chain for your coffee or your phone actually came to be, we have to start by shattering a very pervasive illusion.
A huge myth.
We have to kill the idea that globalization is some shiny modern invention that just popped out of nowhere in the late 20th century.
The historical amnesia around this topic is profound. There's a really strong tendency to treat contemporary globalization as a totally novel phenomenon.
But operating with that blind spot obscures the incredibly long, deep history of long-distance exchange that laid the absolute groundwork for everything we see today.
Exactly.
So where does the timeline actually start? If we are ignoring the 20th century, how far back are we going?
Well, the historian A.G. Hopkins provides a highly respected framework in the sources for categorizing the phases of globalization. And he begins with what he terms archaic globalization.
Archaic globalization.
Right. This describes the long-distance trade and integration of the pre-modern world. So we are looking at vast networks like the Silk Road.
Oh, okay.
That was a highly complex web connecting China, Central Asia, Persia, the Middle East, and eventually the Mediterranean basin. And it had been operating and facilitating exchange for more than a millennium before the European age of exploration even entered the historical chat.
That is wild. 1,000 years before European galleons started crossing oceans, you had caravans navigating deserts and mountains, establishing reliable exchange rates and complex credit systems just to make overland trade viable.
The sophistication of it is very often underestimated. And it wasn't just overland routes either. There was also the Indian Ocean trading world.
Right, the maritime routes.
Yeah, this was an incredibly dense cosmopolitan network of commercial and cultural exchange that connected the coasts of East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia.
And what's fascinating about the Indian Ocean Network is that it operated across massive ethnic, religious, and linguistic boundaries centuries before any European power arrived to try and impose order on the region.
Exactly. Trust and commercial law had to be established through mutual benefit and a shared merchant culture, not just, top-down imperial decree.
The part of archaic globalization that really hooks me, though, is the unintended cargo.
Oh, the hitchhikers?
Yes. It wasn't just silks, spices, and precious metals moving along these routes. Ideas and pathogens were basically hitchhiking on the exact same commercial networks. Let's look at the numeral system we use every single day.
Right.
The numbers you type into your phone's calculator, the ones European mathematicians eventually adopted to build modern science, they didn't originate in Europe. They came from Arabic intermediaries who had themselves adopted them from Indian mathematicians.
The intellectual exchange was flowing seamlessly alongside the physical goods.
Totally. The cultural dimension and the economic dimension were completely intertwined long before we had the vocabulary to describe them as such. But the hitchhikers weren't always beneficial.
No, absolutely not.
The same deep integration that brought revolutionary mathematics to new continents also brought utter devastation. The massive plague pandemics that periodically wiped out unimaginable portions of the population, sweeping from Asia all the way to Western Europe, those were only possible because of these established trading networks.
The plague bacteria literally traveled on the backs of fleas, on the backs of rats hiding in the grain, and the textiles being traded along the Silk Road.
Right. The vulnerability of a connected world isn't a new concept. It's as old as the connections themselves.
That vulnerability and the immense wealth generated by these networks brings us to the next massive historical pivot.
Okay, where does Hopkins take us next?
He transitions from archaic globalization to what he calls proto-globalization. This era is defined by the European-centered expansion that aggressively kicks off in the 15th century. But it's vital to examine the specific geopolitical catalyst for this shift.
Because it wasn't just out of nowhere.
No, the famous European spice trade and the subsequent age of exploration were not merely the result of spontaneous scientific curiosity or, a sudden romantic desire to map the unknown world.
It was a strategic maneuver.
A highly calculated geopolitical response. The Ottoman Empire had risen to immense power and established firm control over the traditional overland trade routes that connected Europe to the wealth of Asia.
They basically controlled the choke point.
Exactly. So European maritime exploration funding Columbus, funding Vasco da Gama, was a desperate attempt to circumvent that Ottoman control.
Ah, I see.
It was a geopolitical shift, attempting to bypass a blockade within an already integrated global trading system. The vast wealth of the East was already a known variable. European powers just needed to find a new, cheaper way to plug into it.
So they take to the seas. The Portuguese push down the African coast, the Spanish head west, and this cascades into European domination of most of the globe by the 19th century.
Right.
And this specific period is absolutely critical to our deep dive because it physically establishes the structural foundations of the contemporary global economy.
Yeah.
But the source material is very clear. We cannot sanitize how those foundations were laid.
No, we have to look directly at the dark engine of early global capitalism.
The historical record is unambiguous on this point. The architecture of our contemporary global economy was constructed through processes of extreme violence, systemic dispossession, and unimaginable human exploitation.
From an analytical perspective, you simply cannot separate the violent processes of colonialism from the massive economic wealth and the financial innovations they eventually produced.
Let's trace the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
How was the first truly global financial market actually capitalized? Like, where did the initial massive injection of wealth come from?
It was funded through sheer extraction, specifically the brutal extraction of silver and gold from the Americas.
Right, like the massive silver mines.
Exactly. Places like the mines of B2-C in present-day Bolivia. This unprecedented influx of precious metals provided the immense liquidity required to fund European commercial expansion, bankroll standing armies, and spur the early development of sophisticated global financial markets.
But that extraction was completely dependent on the forced labor and often the deliberate work into death of indigenous populations.
Which brings us to the transatlantic slave trade. Often, in sanitized tellings of economic history, the slave trade is treated as a terrible moral failing that happened somewhat parallel to the rise of global capitalism.
Well, like an unfortunate side effect.
Exactly, a side effect. But the sources we are analyzing actively dismantle that framing. The forced migration of approximately 12 million Africans to the Americas between the 15th and 19th centuries was not a peripheral event.
It was the central load-bearing pillar of the entire global economic system.
It was the engine itself. That forced displacement, which remains the largest involuntary migration in the entirety of human history, provided the irreplaceable labor force that produced sugar, cotton, and tobacco.
And those three specific crops were the primary high-value commodities driving early transatlantic trade.
Yes, the capital generated from those plantations flowed back to Europe and literally capitalized the Industrial Revolution.
The institutional innovations of this era are staggering when you really look at their origins. Think about the massive joint stock trading companies like the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company.
They held absolute monopolies over colonial commerce.
Right, and they essentially operated as sovereign states with their own armies. Think about the early financial instruments, the insurance markets, the credit systems that had to be invented in London and Amsterdam just to underwrite the massive risk of long-distance, multi-year colonial ventures.
All of that highly sophisticated financial machinery was built directly on top of human extraction and forced labor. The financial architecture was designed specifically to facilitate and protect the profits of that extraction.
And the critical analytical point here is understanding why this specific historical mechanism matters for a deep dive into today's global landscape. Why are we dwelling on the 17th century to explain the 21st?
Because the legacy of those colonial institutions didn't just disappear when the formal empires were dissolved. The impacts persist today, operating on two major tracks: the structural and the psychological.
Let's break those down. How does the structural legacy show up in the modern data?
Structurally, colonial institutions were designed to extract raw materials and export them, while forcing the colonies to import manufactured goods from the imperial center.
So they weren't allowed to build their own factories, essentially.
Exactly. This deliberately prevented the colonies from developing their own robust industrial bases. This created a profound, systemic commodity dependence in many territories across Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia.
That economic architecture, the roads that only go from the mine straight to the port, the lack of diverse domestic industry, that didn't just vanish when a new flag was raised at independence.
Formal colonialism ended, but the structural economic dependence remained deeply embedded in the international system.
And what about the psychological track?
The psychological legacy involves the deep cultural hierarchies, the racial ideologies, and the legitimating narratives that had to be invented to justify the extraction in the first place.
Because you can't sustain a multi-century system of forced labor without a story to tell yourself.
Right. You have to develop a pervasive cultural narrative that rationalizes it. And those psychological hierarchies and biases still subtly and frequently overtly dictate the terms of contemporary international relations, trade negotiations, and global development policies.
It's a dynamic that the slick, modern vocabulary of globalization frequently obscures. We talk about emerging markets and foreign direct investment as if the playing field is entirely neutral, ignoring the fact that the first truly global economic system was constructed with warships, silver monopolies, and brutal human exploitation.
But while that dark engine laid the geographical and financial groundwork, the true acceleration of the system, the moment the world first began to feel distinctly modern in its dizzying speed, that required a fundamental technological revolution.
This moves us right into the 19th century. In our historical framework, we transition from proto-globalization into modern globalization.
Yes, this is the era of genuinely modern, industrially driven integration, where the friction of time and space is suddenly and violently reduced.
The tech boom of the 19th century is genuinely awe-inspiring. I mean, we suffer from extreme recency bias. We think the internet is the ultimate unmatched game changer.
Right, everyone thinks it's all about the 90s.
But look at the sheer paradigm shift of the 1800s. First, you have the deployment of steamships. For thousands of years, global trade was entirely at the mercy of the wind and the weather.
Steamships completely revolutionized ocean travel. They dramatically cut down the time it took to move goods, but more importantly, they introduced absolute predictability.
You could schedule a global supply chain for the very first time.
Then you add the telegraph. And this cannot be overstated. Suddenly, for the very first time in the history of the human race, you have near instantaneous cross-continental communication.
Information could travel faster than a physical human being or a physical letter could move.
The separation of communication from transportation.
Exactly that. A merchant in London could know the price of cotton in New York within minutes, rather than waiting weeks for a ship to arrive with the news.
And on land, this era saw the explosive, rapid spread of railway networks across Europe, North America, and massive infrastructural pushes in parts of Asia and Africa.
What did the railways do to the internal economies of these countries?
They took previously isolated, localized regional markets and forcibly linked them together. Before the railway, a farmer's market was limited to how far a horse-drawn cart could travel before the produce rotted.
Right.
The railway created cohesive national markets and then immediately integrated those national markets into the international trading system through the ports.
And all of this technological acceleration was financially lubricated by the monetary coordination of the gold standard, alongside a general trend of falling tariffs and trade barriers.
The scale of what was happening during this specific window, essentially the decades leading up to 1914 and the outbreak of World War I, is staggering. We hinted at this in the introduction, but the numbers really bear it out.
The data is remarkable, but the scale of economic integration achieved by 1914 was not matched again until the late 1980s or early 1990s.
If you examine capital flows, the amount of money being invested across borders, as a proportion of global GDP, the levels in 1914 were entirely comparable to, and in some specific metrics actually exceeded, contemporary levels of financial globalization.
Wow. And it wasn't just capital flowing, it was human beings. The fourth dimension we talked about, migration, was operating at an unprecedented scale.
You had this enormous, entirely voluntary mass migration flowing primarily from Europe to the Americas and to Australasia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Millions of people packing up and crossing oceans for better wages. It remains one of the largest voluntary movements of people in recorded history.
But just like the economic integration we're living through today, that massive 19th century integration had profound distributional consequences. It did not enrich everyone equally.
It created highly distinct, highly localized winners and losers.
And to understand the mechanics of this, we have to look at the vital research of economic historians Kevin O'Rourke and Jeffrey Williamson. They extensively studied the economic fallout of this specific period.
And their work centers heavily on a phenomenon called commodity price convergence, right? I want to make sure we understand the mechanics of this because it sounds like academic jargon, but it clearly has real human impact. What actually happens on the ground during commodity price convergence?
Well, think about the transportation revolution we just discussed. As the cost of shipping plummeted due to the efficiency of steamships and the reach of railways, the prices of basic goods across different continents began to converge.
They started to equalize because the cost of moving the good was no longer a massive barrier.
Exactly. The clearest historical example is grain. Because of the new transport technology, suddenly, massively cheap grain from land-abundant countries like the vast plains of the United States, Canada, and Argentina could efficiently flood into European markets.
Okay, so if I'm an industrial factory worker living in London or Berlin, this is incredible news, right?
Oh, it's a massive windfall. For the urban industrial working class and consumers in Europe, this was a huge win. Their baseline cost of living dropped significantly because their primary food staple became dramatically cheaper.
Their real wages effectively increased without their employers having to pay them a penny more.
Right, but if you're a European grain farmer,
Oh, man.
if you are a European grain farmer or an agricultural laborer in rural Europe, it is an absolute catastrophe. You simply cannot compete with the sheer volume and the rock-bottom prices of the imported grain from the Americas.
Your livelihood is systematically destroyed by the exact same market mechanism that is happily feeding the factory worker in the city.
The integration creates a clear domestic loser.
The parallel to modern times here is practically blinking in neon lights. But O'Rourke and Williamson also looked at the other side of the ocean. What was happening in the so-called settler economies, places like the United States and Australia?
These were countries with an entirely different economic makeup. They had massive, seemingly endless supplies of abundant land, but they had very scarce labor. There just weren't enough workers. So as they integrated into the global economy and started exporting massive amounts of agricultural products, the value of their abundant resource land went up. And because labor was scarce and desperately needed to work the land and build the infrastructure, the wages for labor went up significantly.
Which is initially a fantastic scenario for workers and landowners in the US and Australia.
Very much so.
Let me play this out logically, though. If you have a deeply integrated global system with cheap transport and suddenly wages in the United States and Australia are skyrocketing compared to wages in Europe, what happens next?
Massive labor mobility. The millions of voluntary migrants we discussed earlier, people in Europe look at the high wages in the Americas and they migrate to capture that premium.
And here's the political trigger. As that massive influx of migration continued year after year, it directly sparked intense political pressure from the domestic native-born workers in those high-wage countries.
The local workers saw the incoming migrants as a direct threat.
Right. They wanted to restrict immigration to protect their artificially high wages from being driven down by a massive new supply of competing labor.
And that exact dynamic, the fierce political backlash against late 19th century globalization, is precisely what we need to study. That era did not end in peaceful, harmonious integration.
No. It culminated in a massive rise in protectionist trade policies, the implementation of severe, often racially based immigration restrictions in the US and Australia, and a surging wave of nationalist politics globally.
This isn't just trivia. This period is the exact historical precedent required to analyze the political dynamics of contemporary globalization's fiercest critics today. It's the same structural tension between mobile factors of production and immobile local populations.
It's the exact same script, just playing out a century later. But of course, this first era of modern globalization didn't just slowly fade out due to tariffs. It was violently, catastrophically shattered.
By the outbreak of World War I in 1914.
It literally tore the integrated global system apart. Nations that were deep trading partners one week were slaughtering each other the next. And whatever fragile fragments of integration survived the First World War were completely obliterated by the devastating economic collapse of the Great Depression. The system broke entirely.
Which meant that in the aftermath of World War II, amidst the rubble of a shattered global economy, the architects of the New World Order had to sit down and completely redesign the international economic system from the ground up.
And they were designing it with a very specific, overwhelming psychological trauma hanging over them, the trauma of the 1930s. The economists and diplomats who gathered to build the post-WWII order were absolutely terrified of repeating the catastrophic mistakes of the Great Depression.
The prevailing economic consensus at the time, right, was that the severe protectionist beggar-thy-neighbor policies of the 1930s had disastrously deepened and prolonged the global depression.
During the 1930s, as economies stumbled, countries continuously raised massive tariffs against each other in a desperate, ultimately self-defeating attempt to protect their own domestic industries from foreign competition.
Global trade practically ground to a halt, which only accelerated the economic collapse and fostered the extreme political radicalization that led to the Second World War.
So the post-war architects set out to build an institutional firewall, a system designed to make those kinds of destructive trade wars practically impossible.
That is the foundation of the institutional architecture of now. The famous Bretton Woods agreements, forged in 1944, established the foundational pillars.
The International Monetary Fund to manage currency stability, the World Bank to fund reconstruction and development, and eventually the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which evolved into the World Trade Organization.
And this new framework was not merely a suggestion. It was explicitly designed to force international monetary coordination and mandate progressive, binding, step-by-step trade liberalization.
They were actively hardwiring economic integration into the foundational political roles of the new global economy.
Exactly.
And for a few decades, that system ticked along steadily, primarily integrating the industrialized Western economies. But then we hit the 1970s and 1980s, and the integration absolutely turbocharges.
We witness a massive acceleration of modern integration, driven by a perfect convergence of powerful forces.
First, you have the deliberate, policy-driven reduction of trade barriers through successive, complex rounds of multilateral GATT negotiations.
Second, you see a widespread ideological shift toward the liberalization of global capital markets, governments removing the friction, making it easier and faster for massive amounts of investment capital to flow across borders with a keystroke.
And crucially, those policy choices were supercharged by two massive technological revolutions. One of those revolutions is incredibly flashy and changed our daily lives, and the other is almost completely invisible to the average person, yet it physically reshaped the planet.
Let's start with the invisible one, the container shipping revolution.
It sounds aggressively boring, just standardizing the size of corrugated metal boxes, but it was a massive system-altering paradigm shift.
Oh, totally. Before containerization, international shipping was known as break bulk shipping. It was a chaotic, incredibly labor-intensive nightmare.
Goods were packed in barrels, sacks, and wooden crates of every conceivable size.
Loading and unloading a single cargo ship could take weeks, requiring armies of dock workers to manually haul and stow each item. The sheer cost and time of logistics were massive natural tariffs on global trade.
And then the standardized shipping container arrives. Suddenly, goods are packed once at the factory, the entire container is lifted onto a truck, transferred seamlessly by crane to a massive ship, and lifted onto a train at the destination port without anyone ever touching the contents.
It dramatically, permanently reduced the cost and the time required for international logistics. It made a truly global physical supply chain economically viable for everyday goods.
The more visible revolution, of course, was in information and communication technology. The telecom boom, the laying of undersea fiber optic cables, and the eventual explosion of the internet.
This effectively eliminated the cost of coordinating complex production across massive geographic distances.
Right, because without instant, reliable, high-bandwidth global communication, a multinational corporation simply cannot manage a fragmented supply chain where the engineering design happens in California, the component manufacturing in Taiwan, and the final assembly in Vietnam.
The internet provided the central nervous system for a physically dispersed global factory.
The stage is completely set. The international institutions are enforcing the rules, the standardized ships have slashed the cost of movement, the fiber optic cables are instantly connecting the management offices, the engine is primed.
And then we hit the year 2001.
This is the ultimate turning point. If you want to understand the economic anxiety of the 21st century, you have to look at what the source material identifies as arguably the single most consequential economic event of recent history.
China officially joining the World Trade Organization.
It is genuinely difficult to overstate the magnitude of that specific geopolitical and economic event. When China acceded to the WTO in 2001, it fully and officially integrated its massive, rapidly industrializing economy into the rule-based global trading system.
In doing so, it effectively added approximately 800 million workers to the accessible global labor market in what was, historically speaking, the blink of an eye.
800 million workers just injected into the global supply chain overnight.
Right.
This completely transformed the fundamental mathematics of global manufacturing.
It was a shock to the system unlike anything seen since the Industrial Revolution. And we must be objective about the dual nature of this shock.
Right, because the aggregate global benefits were historically unprecedented.
Yes, it facilitated, as we noted at the beginning, the greatest and fastest reduction in extreme human poverty ever recorded, lifting hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens into the middle class. Furthermore, it provided Western consumers with an ocean of cheap, accessible manufactured goods, keeping inflation astonishingly low for decades.
But the localized costs in the developed nations were incredibly severe. And this brings us to the pivotal, paradigm-shifting research of the economist David Otter. He and his colleagues extensively studied what they termed the China shock.
And we need to take time to rigorously and impartially discuss the reality of this shock, particularly its impact on manufacturing hubs in the U.S. Midwest and the Southeast.
Otter's research is vital because it challenged a deeply held assumption within mainstream trade economics.
For decades, the prevailing economic models offered a very specific, somewhat comforting prediction about what would happen when a wealthy country opened up trade with a massive, lower-wage country.
The models acknowledged there would be friction, sure. They assumed there would be some short-term job displacement in specific manufacturing sectors.
But crucially, the models assumed that labor markets were frictionless, meaning that a worker who lost a factory job in Ohio would smoothly and relatively quickly transition to a new, perhaps more productive service sector job in the same region, or simply move to a different state where jobs are plentiful.
The models essentially assume that human beings are as easily reallocated as financial capital.
Exactly. Just shift them to another column on the spreadsheet. But Otter's empirical research documented something entirely different occurring in reality.
The impact of Chinese import competition on U.S. manufacturing employment didn't just cause a temporary mild adjustment period.
No, the job losses in heavily exposed specific industries and specifically located communities were substantially larger, much more geographically concentrated, and far more persistent than any mainstream economic model had predicted.
And we have to move beyond just the economic metrics here because we are talking about human lives and the collapse of entire civic ecosystems. The aggregate models completely failed to predict the persistent, hyper-localized devastation.
Let's look at a concrete scenario. When a town in North Carolina that relied entirely on textile manufacturing suddenly found itself competing directly with a flood of vastly cheaper Chinese imports, it didn't just experience a temporary dip in local employment.
That factory closed permanently.
And the workers didn't seamlessly transition into becoming software engineers or move to California. They remained in the community.
These towns experienced severe long-term employment declines, permanently suppressed local wages, and a massive drop in local tax revenue, which then degraded schools and public services.
The economic decline cascaded directly into profound social deterioration. Autor's analysis is so sobering because it extends beyond tracking lost wages. It documents tragic, measurable health and social outcomes in these specifically affected geographic zones.
The data reveals highly significant increases in mortality from drug overdoses, suicides, and alcohol-related liver disease.
These are the tragedies often categorized as deaths of despair. And crucially, they were occurring in these trade-shocked communities at rates significantly higher than the broad national economic averages would ever have suggested.
Because the national averages act as a cloaking device,
Yes.
the aggregate model looks at the country as a whole. The macroeconomic dashboard flashes green. Overall GDP is up. Overall consumer purchasing power is up because flat screen TVs are cheap. The stock market is soaring.
The country, on paper, is winning.
But that aggregate dashboard completely masks the reality that an entire community has just lost its primary economic engine and its social anchor.
The aggregate benefit obscures the localized devastation. And this disconnect has profound, world-altering political implications.
When political scientists analyze the geographic concentration of support for anti-establishment, economic nationalist, and populist political movements over the last decade, the maps align incredibly closely with the precise communities that were most heavily exposed to the China shock.
This changes how we view recent history. When we look at the massive political earthquakes of recent years, the stunning vote for Brexit in the United Kingdom, the election of Donald Trump in the United States, the broad rise of populist anti-globalization movements across Western Europe, seeing these devastating local impacts completely shifts the narrative.
Those political events look much less like unexplainable chaotic anomalies or temporary fits of madness, and much more like the entirely predictable, inevitable consequences of an economic system functioning exactly the way the hard data says it functioned.
This represents a critical transition point for our analysis. We need to look directly and objectively at the rationality of this political backlash.
Right. There has been a very pervasive, often condescending narrative within mainstream economic commentary and elite political circles that attempts to casually dismiss the entire backlash against globalization.
They wave away the voters' anger as mere nostalgia for a bygone era, or they attribute it to a fundamental, uneducated misunderstanding of how economics works, or they claim it is entirely the artificial creation of opportunistic, demagogic politicians manipulating irrational economic anxiety for personal gain.
And the research we are unpacking firmly rejects that dismissive myth. Writing off the political backlash of the working class as just ignorance is not only arrogant, it actively ignores the empirical data we just discussed. It ignores the lived reality of the people whose communities were hollowed out.
To truly understand why the political backlash is entirely rational for the people experiencing it, we have to examine the core economic defense of free trade itself. The foundational argument that economists use to defend free trade is the concept of comparative advantage.
Let's define that. Comparative advantage is the idea that nations benefit from specializing in the production of goods they can produce relatively efficiently and trading for the goods that other nations produce relatively efficiently.
Right.
And the counterintuitive part is that even if country A is absolutely better and faster at making literally everything than country B, it still makes mathematical sense for country A to specialize in its most profitable sector and trade with country B for the rest. Overall global output increases.
That is correct. At the aggregate global level and over the long run, the theory of comparative advantage holds true. The global pie gets bigger.
But the mainstream political defense of globalization often stops right there, at the aggregate benefit, conveniently omitting the vital qualifications.
Comparative advantage does not imply that every single individual within a participating country will benefit. It does not imply that the short-run adjustment costs for displaced workers are small or manageable. And it absolutely does not account for the severe political and social consequences that occur when specific communities are structurally disrupted.
So how do we explain those blind spots? How do we map who actually wins and loses within a specific country?
To see the distributional impact, we have to apply another foundational economic framework, the Heckscher-Ohlin model.
Okay, the Heckscher-Ohlin model.
Yes. This model predicts exactly how the gains and losses of trade are distributed internally. The core premise of the model is that countries will export goods that intensely use the factors of production like land, labor, or capital that are abundant within their borders, and they will import goods that use factors of production that are scarce within their borders. Furthermore, the model states that when a country liberalizes trade, the financial returns to its abundant factors will increase, but the returns to its scarce factors will decrease.
Okay, let's put this firmly on the ground with a concrete scenario. Let's look at capital-abundant, highly developed nations like the United States or Germany. In the context of the vast global market, what is the relatively scarce factor of production in those countries? In developed nations, relative to the massive global pool, the scarce factor is unskilled or semi-skilled labor.
So if I am tracking the logic of the Heckscher-Ohlin model, if unskilled labor is the scarce factor, the mathematical model explicitly predicts that opening up a developed country to deep global trade will put severe downward pressure on the wages of unskilled workers in that country.
Exactly. The wage suppression for the working class in developed nations is not an accident. It is not an unintended glitch or a failure of the globalization model. It is a built-in, fully anticipated mathematical feature of the model.
Wow.
When you deeply integrate a highly capital-rich country with a massively labor-rich country, the capital owners and the highly educated knowledge workers in the rich country win big. The multinational corporations win big.
But the factory workers in the rich country now face intense direct wage competition from millions of workers overseas.
It is a feature, not a bug. Therefore, if you are one of those domestic workers experiencing stagnant wages and job insecurity, voting for protectionist nationalist policies is not a sign of ignorance. It is a highly rational, self-interested attempt to use your political power to protect your own livelihood from a market mechanism that actively devalues your labor.
That reframes the entire political debate. When you break down the underlying mechanics, it makes perfect sense. But pure economics, devoid of political context, only provides half the picture.
Right, economics without politics.
Exactly. To truly grasp why the entire global international order feels so incredibly unstable and fraught right now, we need to introduce the work of the political economist Donny Roderick, specifically his concept known as the trilemma of the global economy.
Roderick's trilemma is arguably the most clarifying framework available for understanding contemporary geopolitics. The premise is structural contradiction. Roderick identifies three vital goals that modern societies generally strive for: deep economic integration, national sovereignty, and democratic politics.
Deep integration, national sovereignty, and democratic politics. To make it accessible, I like comparing it to the classic project management triangle. Fast, cheap, good, pick two.
That's a perfect analogy.
Because the core thesis of the trilemma is that it is structurally impossible for a society to simultaneously achieve all three. Any combination of two absolutely requires significantly limiting or entirely abandoning the third.
Let's test the constraints of this trilemma. Let's walk through the pairings. What happens if a society decides it wants deep economic integration with the world, and it also wants to maintain robust, responsive democratic politics?
If you demand deep integration and democracy, you must sacrifice national sovereignty.
Right. To make a deeply integrated, frictionless global market function democratically, you have to create powerful supranational governance structures that can make and enforce the rules for everyone, overriding local laws.
The clearest real-world example of this attempt is the European Union. Member states achieve incredibly deep economic integration, and they maintain democratic systems. But to make the frictionless single market work, they had to surrender vast, significant portions of their independent national sovereignty to the central authorities and courts in Brussels.
The nation-state is no longer the ultimate arbiter of its own economic rules.
Okay, what if I choose a different path? What if I want the wealth of deep economic integration, but I am fiercely protective, and I absolutely refuse to give up my national sovereignty to an international body?
If you choose deep integration and national sovereignty, you must systematically limit democratic politics.
Yeah.
If you want a perfectly integrated global economy that is still run by independent, sovereign nation states, You have to heavily insulate your domestic economic policy from the democratic pressures of your own citizens.
Think back to our discussion of the Heckscher-Ohlin model. Deep integration inevitably creates intense local losers.
And if those local losers retain full, unhindered democratic power, they will eventually vote to raise tariffs and end the integration to protect themselves.
Therefore, to sustain the frictionless global market within a sovereign state, the elites essentially have to take the steering wheel of economic decision-making out of the hands of the voters.
Exactly. They have to delegate power to insulated technocrats, central banks, and binding international trade treaties that the public cannot easily vote to overturn. The democracy becomes hollowed out on economic issues.
That dynamic feels incredibly familiar to the political rhetoric we see today, the anger against unaccountable technocrats and trade deals. Let's look at the final pairing. What if a society demands complete, unyielding national sovereignty and fully responsive, robust democratic politics?
If you prioritize sovereignty and democracy, you must willingly abandon deep economic integration. You have to be prepared to raise trade barriers, severely limit the flow of international capital, and step back from the hyper-connected global system.
Because if your sovereign democratic public demands protection from the severe disruptions and wage pressures of the global market, you must have the policy freedom to build those protective walls, which fundamentally breaks the integration.
This trilemma perfectly explains the agonizing structural instability we are witnessing globally. Attempting to have all three at the exact same time is precisely what is tearing at the seams of the international order.
Politicians stand on debate stages and promise the impossible. They promise the massive wealth of deep global integration, they promise absolute unyielding national sovereignty, and they promise that the government will be completely responsive to the democratic will of the working class voters.
And when they inevitably crash into the structural reality of the trilemma and fail to deliver all three simultaneously, the voters revolt.
It is an irreconcilable structural contradiction. And navigating the painful trade-offs, deciding which of those three cherished options a society is finally willing to limit or sacrifice, is the defining, overarching political struggle of our contemporary era.
That framework cuts through so much of the daily noise.
It really does. But while the intense friction of economic integration and the trilemma dominates the political headlines, there is another massive dimension operating alongside it. A dimension that is quietly, fundamentally rewiring how human beings actually communicate, how we perceive the world, and how we form our core identities.
We need to pivot our analysis to the fifth section, cultural flows and the rise of the global lingua franca.
This is crucial because economic globalization never happens in a vacuum. It is deeply intertwined with and accelerated by massive cultural flows.
This dimension encompasses the relentless movement of ideas, media, cultural practices, consumer trends, and symbolic resources across national and cultural boundaries.
And much like the economic dimension, this cultural globalization has generated its own complex set of consequences, incredible achievements, and intense anxieties.
When we discuss cultural flows, the most dominant, highly visible examples are usually American exports. We are talking about the staggering global dominance of the Hollywood film industry, the pervasive reach of American popular music, and increasingly, the monopolistic power of social media platforms engineered and headquartered in Silicon Valley.
These entities distribute cultural products, narratives, and values at a scale and speed that is historically unprecedented.
And that sheer scale exerts profound pressure. It heavily influences local cultures, and in certain vulnerable domains, the influx of heavily financed global media can entirely displace or drown out local cultural production.
But I want to push back on that a bit. Are we just slowly becoming a monoculture? Is the whole world just being Americanized?
The source material provides a deeply necessary corrective to that specific anxiety. The fear of cultural homogenization is reacting to a very real process of cultural power, but it vastly overstates how absolute and complete that process actually is. It treats human beings as passive receptacles.
But audiences around the world are not just empty sponges uncritically soaking up American culture.
Global cultural flows do not operate on a one-way street. When local audiences consume global cultural products, a film, a song, a meme, they actively reinterpret those products. They appropriate them, filter them, and adapt them to their own highly specific local contexts and pre-existing cultural frameworks. They do not just passively accept the intended message.
So a teenager in Tokyo or Mumbai watching a massive Hollywood blockbuster is not simply absorbing an American worldview wholesale. They are filtering that narrative through their own deeply embedded cultural lens, extracting different meanings, and often utilizing those global symbols to create something entirely new and locally relevant.
Precisely. They create localized meaning out of globalized content. The result is rarely pure erasure. Instead, the collision often generates vibrant, new, hybrid cultural forms, complex blends of language, musical traditions, fashion, humor, and identity. This dynamic hybridization is what truly characterizes the lived reality of contemporary urban culture worldwide today.
However, the most complex and volatile dynamic within cultural globalization right now is the architecture of the internet itself. The digital infrastructure we have constructed presents a profound, seemingly unresolvable paradox.
On one hand, it functions as the ultimate engine for cultural integration and diversity. It allows incredibly niche, highly specific global subcultures to thrive.
Individuals who share a passionate engagement with a highly specific intellectual tradition, an obscure artistic movement, or a marginalized identity can easily find each other and form a robust, supportive, global community of interest, completely independent of their physical geographic isolation.
That level of connection was physically impossible before the advent of digital communication.
It is the ultimate connector. It destroys the tyranny of geography.
It does, but the paradox is that it is a severely double-edged sword. That exact same decentralized, globally spanning architecture is currently being highly effectively deployed and weaponized by authoritarian regimes and extreme nationalist movements.
These groups utilize the global communication infrastructure to coordinate political movements, spread disinformation, and organize attacks whose explicit stated goal is to dismantle the very liberal international order and the integrated systems that the Internet's architects originally intended it to support.
It is a staggering contradiction. The ultimate technological tool built specifically to connect the world, operating on infrastructure that crosses oceans, is being efficiently utilized to coordinate the political movements desperately trying to build walls and sever those connections.
But to participate in any of this, to navigate the global internet, to coordinate a multinational supply chain, to engage in cross-border cultural exchange, you require a shared medium. You need a way to communicate. Which brings us directly to the lived experience of the listener engaging with this deep dive right now.
Because the most visible, undeniable dimension of contemporary cultural globalization is the entrenched spread of English as the global lingua franca.
It is the essential, foundational enabler of nearly everything we have discussed. English has cemented itself as the default global language of commerce, scientific research, international diplomacy, aviation, and increasingly global youth culture.
It operates both as an enabling condition that makes rapid economic integration possible and as an immense cultural force that fundamentally reshapes educational priorities and personal identities across the globe.
But why English? How did it achieve this unprecedented status as the default operating system for the globe?
The dominance of English is the result of a compounding combination of three major historical forces. First, you have the immense historical legacy of British imperial expansion, which aggressively planted the language in key strategic and administrative locations globally over centuries.
Second, you have the overwhelming, unmatched economic, military, and cultural dominance of the United States throughout the entirety of the 20th century.
And third, and currently most powerful, you have immense self-reinforcing network effects.
Let's define the network effect in this context. It means that the language that already possesses the most speakers becomes increasingly exponentially valuable for everyone else to learn, simply because it connects you to the largest possible network of people and resources.
And once that critical mass is achieved, the dynamic essentially locks itself in and reinforces itself continuously. Currently, approximately 1.4 billion people speak English as either a first or a second language. It is, by a substantial margin, the most widely spoken language on Earth.
But the metric that is truly crucial for understanding globalization is that English is the language most heavily utilized in international communication, specifically between non-native speakers.
The source material uses a brilliant, highly specific scenario to illustrate this reality. Imagine a specialized Brazilian engineer and a specialized Korean engineer.
They are both employed by a massive German multinational corporation, and they have been stationed together to manage a facility located in Singapore.
When those two engineers sit down in a conference room to troubleshoot a complex technical issue, what language are they utilizing to conduct their professional communication? They are not speaking Portuguese, Korean, or German. They will speak in English.
It is the necessary connective tissue of the global supply chain. And this dynamic operates at the highest, most consequential institutional levels as well. The International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and the vast majority of international financial and scientific institutions operate primarily and often exclusively in English.
And we have to emphasize that this is not merely a matter of linguistic convenience. It has a very real, highly measurable financial impact on the trajectories of human lives.
It has a profound economic impact. The financial value of English fluency in the modern global economy is immense.
Rigorous economic research into wage premiums for English speakers, particularly within developing economies, consistently documents highly significant life-altering earnings advantages for individuals who possess English proficiency compared to their peers who do not.
It functions as a literal, measurable premium paid for the ability to plug into the global system.
Precisely. Whether it is achieved through securing employment with a multinational corporation, engaging in lucrative international trade, or simply possessing the ability to access and utilize the vast, largely English-based global knowledge resources available on the internet, the contemporary global economy places a massive, undeniable premium on English communication skills.
And crucially, the economic data clearly demonstrates that the growth of this specific wage premium over the past 3 decades tracks in near-perfect lockstep alongside the intensification of economic globalization itself.
Which provides the perfect opportunity to loop all of these massive historical and economic concepts back to where we started.
Back to the immediate physical environment surrounding you right now. Think again about that globally sourced shirt you are wearing, the meticulously engineered smartphone resting in your pocket, and the complex agricultural supply chain that delivered the coffee you drank this morning.
We have seen throughout this deep dive that this incredible, seemingly seamless global integration you rely on daily is not magic, and it is certainly not an entirely new phenomenon. It is a massive, complex architecture built iteratively over centuries.
It was built upon archaic trade routes, where revolutionary ideas and devastating plagues traveled hand in hand. It was capitalized by the horrifying violence of colonial extraction and the brutal engine of the transatlantic slave trade.
It was mechanically accelerated by the technological revolutions of steamships, telegraphs, and later standardized shipping containers and undersea fiber optic cables.
And its current rules were deliberately, meticulously designed by post-war institutions terrified of repeating the catastrophic economic collapse of the Great Depression.
And as we have rigorously explored, this system carries a ledger of massive, world-altering human benefits, such as the greatest acceleration of wealth and reduction in extreme poverty ever recorded, inextricably linked alongside devastating, highly localized human costs.
Costs like the structural destruction of manufacturing communities and the resulting tragic epidemics of social despair. The models predicted the wealth, but they vastly underestimated the pain of the friction.
And simply by actively listening to this deep dive, which you are doing in English, the global lingua franca, likely accessing the audio via a globally distributed podcast app or a social platform powered by international server farms, you are actively participating in and benefiting from the cultural and economic dimensions of the very phenomena we just spent this time analyzing.
You are not just an observer. You are an active node in the network.
You are. And actively understanding the deep historical roots, the mathematical economic tensions, and the cultural paradoxes within that network is the only viable way to make sense of the volatile, rapidly shifting world as it exists today.
Which brings us to a final, lingering thought. I want to leave you with a provocation directly inspired by the collision of Roderick's trilemma and the realities of our hyper-connected digital age.
Think deeply about the Internet's current role as both the ultimate borderless connector and the ultimate highly efficient tool for nationalist disruption.
If deep economic integration is fundamentally structurally at odds with maintaining national sovereignty and responsive democratic politics, and the Internet is increasingly being utilized by voters to aggressively assert that national sovereignty, are we currently witnessing the messy, chaotic end of globalization as we know it? Or are we simply watching the global system brutally and painfully renegotiate which of Roderick's 3 cherished options it is going to abandon next?
It's a profound question.
The next time you reach into your closet and put on your globally sourced shirt, take a second to ask yourself, how much democratic choice did it actually take to get it there?